Welcome to the deep dive. This is where we take your sources, big or small, and really dig into them to find the most compelling insights. Think of us as your guides, helping you cut through all the noise and get right to the heart of the matter. Today we're doing something a little different, taking a historical look, but through a very specific viewpoint. It's H.G. Wells traveling through the United States way back in the early 1900s. Our source is his book, The Future in America, A Search After Realities, which came out in 1907, I believe. Now, Wells didn't show up thinking he had a crystal ball. He wasn't there to just predict some fixed destiny. He had a deeper goal, to understand what he called the thing that must needs make that future, the nation's will, as he put it. And he came with this really interesting mindset, one that had already shifted, from trying to make rigid predictions to a more, let's say, analytical or scientific way of looking at causes and trends. And then finally, to this sort of philosophical view that really stressed how critical human choice, human free will actually is in shaping what happens next.
Yeah. And what's so fascinating, I think, is that this isn't just like a travel diary. I went here, I saw this.
Yeah.
Wells is really using the journey itself as a almost like an investigation, right, into the basic forces that were shaping American society at this really pivotal moment. I mean, things were booming. So he's looking at everything, the sheer scale of the cities and industry, which was just overwhelming, but also the economic structures underneath it all, the social challenges, which were huge, the massive influx of immigrants, the state of sort of intellectual life, and what he was trying to pin down as the essential character of Americans.
Right. So that's what we're going to unpack. Wells's own firsthand impressions. We'll look at his sheer astonishment sometimes at the scale of things, some of his surprising takes on property, corruption, the lives of workers, immigrants, and ultimately that search he was on for this kind of elusive American will. It's a real deep dive into what one very sharp observer saw as the realities and, the potent possibilities and maybe dangers for America's future more than a century ago.
Okay, so let's start where he started. Arriving in America right off the bat, he's just floored by the scale. The physical bigness, he contrasts it quite sharply with, earlier visitors like Dickens. He sails in on the Carmania, calls it a floating city, huge ship, over 3,000 people. Makes Dickens' old ship, the Britannia, seem, tiny in comparison.
And he sees the speed, the efficiency of it all. But there's also this slightly unsettling feeling he captures. He talks about the passengers having this mysterious smallness, like they weren't quite growing with the machine, feeling like flies on a machine that's got loose, I think is his phrase.
Yeah.
And that tension, between this huge mechanical progress and the sort of dwarfed human element, that's the theme he definitely carries ashore with him.
Absolutely, because that sense of overwhelming scale, it just keeps going. New York skyscrapers, for instance, they're not just tall buildings to him. They feel like these immense incompleteness, like they're still in process of eruption, he says, with steam venting off them. He calls them lavish of light and everything else, suggesting this almost inexhaustible supply behind it all.
Right.
And the Brooklyn Bridge, it's not just design. It has this quality of necessity, this inanimate immensity. It feels inevitable.
But then he hits Boston, and it's a totally different vibe, isn't it, in terms of growth? Wells sees its serene preparation. He notices it's growing deliberately through planning. A city commission had apparently laid out wide avenues, parks, reservations. It's a conscious effort to, guide development, which really stands out against New York's more chaotic, blind enlargement, as he saw it.
And this contrast, it leads him to places where that sheer power, that material force, feels really raw, unchecked, maybe, like Niagara Falls. The natural wonder is still there, obviously, but it's almost ground out by all the human stuff around it, the hotels, the souvenir shops, But what really grabs him is the power struggle over harnessing the falls for electricity.
Yeah, that Niagara struggle, it's kind of a perfect symbol for the big question Wells keeps asking about America's will. Okay, you've got this immense natural power, right?
Yeah.
And now it's being turned into immense industrial power.
Yeah.
So is that power going to be used for something, grand, collective, something truly progressive? Or is it just going to end up, as he puts it, turning great wheels for excursionists, stamping out aluminum fancywear and illuminating night advertisements? He kind of suspects the huge social and industrial process of America will win and at last capture Niagara altogether. But the key question for him is, okay, captured for what purpose? What's the end game?
And talking about raw power. And then he goes to Chicago. He calls it the dark disorder of growth. It sounds pretty intense. A 19th century nightmare, he says. Smoky streets, crowds jostling, these monstrous shapes of industry like the Standard Oil plant looming over things. And then there's Packingtown, the stockyards, literally feeding the world, right? He describes it as just stinking. A center of distribution for disease and decay, an arena of shabby evasions and extra profits. He's really struck by this almost grotesque combination of efficiency and, well, squalor.
And all these observations, the scale, the industry, they naturally lead him to look at the economics of it all. He sees unbelievable wealth being created faster than ever before. But his key insight, I think, is about its distribution. He notes how this wealth is piling up with a few great getters, he calls them, like the Standard Oil Group. Meanwhile, the average person, okay, they look prosperous compared to Europe, maybe riding the subway, dressed decently, but he says they're not consciously defeated, but only failing to get a large share in the increment of wealth. So there's this feeling of being left behind, relatively speaking, even if maybe their absolute situation isn't terrible.
And this is where he stumbles onto something that genuinely shocks him, something that flies right in the face of that image of, universal American prosperity. He sees this exhausted 11-year-old messenger boy in the New York subway at like 2 a.m. And this one small detail, it just opens his eyes to how widespread child labor actually was. He calls it America's weakest spot.
Yeah.
He mentions seeing drowsy little messenger boys, kids selling newspapers, shining shoes everywhere.
And he relays these accounts from a reformer, a guy named Spargo, that are just, well, they're startling. Tiny kids, 5, 6 years old, working 12-hour days in southern cotton mills. Or, 10, 11-year-olds in Pennsylvania, coal breakers, the breaker boys, stooping over the chute and picking out the slate, often getting terribly mangled, he says, or even smothered to death. It's horrific. And Wells connects us directly back to what he sees as a fundamental issue with the American system itself. This institutional theory built on the absolute liberty of property and the idea that the state should basically serve business. His insight is that this whole framework it disregards women and children, the cardinal facts of life altogether. They are private things. The system prioritizes property, he argues, over people, especially the most vulnerable.
That idea, that theory of unchecked property rights, it seems really central to how he starts to understand the American character. He sees Americans as fundamentally middle class in outlook, fiercely individualistic,
right,
with this almost like religious devotion to the liberty of property, which he thought was, maybe ironically, symbolized by the Statue of Liberty itself.
Yeah, and his insight there is about how this intense focus on individualism, on getting, plays out across the board. It leads, in Wells's view, directly to what Americans call graft. But he defines graft much more broadly than just, say, political payoffs. He sees it as a defective moral method found in every department of American life. Like, it's systemic. It's this pervasive culture where the average American, he felt, lives to get that come out of every transaction with more than he gave. He uses that really vivid example of the Chicago alderman Hinky Dink Kenna. Tough guy, pragmatic, loyal to his own people, his crowd, but operating entirely within this deeply commercialized transactional sort of ethics that Wells thought was just baked into the system.
And layering onto all of this complexity, you've got this huge wave of immigration happening. Wells sees the sheer numbers at Ellis Island, the wholesale and multitudinous quality, thousands arriving every day from all over Europe. He sees the official policy, assimilation. He sees immigrant kids singing patriotic songs, pledging allegiance. But his observation goes deeper. He sees the reality of exploitation that's often waiting for them. And he worries that the scale and diversity of this new wave, especially people from Southern and Eastern Europe, could actually lead to a dreadful separation of class and kind, making real assimilation harder, maybe even creating permanent underclasses.
And this concern about intolerance, maybe a kind of hastiness in judgment, leads him to look at specific cases that really bother him. He's appalled by what happened to this guy McQueen, an English socialist. Seemed well-meaning. Tried to help striking workers in Paterson, New Jersey, ends up jailed for 5 years, while the guys who actually did the violence apparently got off lightly. Or the whole Maxim Gorky affair, the famous Russian writer, invited over as this big symbol of freedom, then suddenly just viciously attacked and ostracized by the press because of his personal life, completely wrecking his mission. Wells was just shocked by how swift and harsh that judgment was.
Yeah, and he also looks at the deep-seated issues around race, the treatment of African Americans. He writes about meeting Booker T. Washington, going to a meeting at Hull House with educated Black people who are facing just a pervasive prejudice, witnessing the absurdity of the Jim Crow system firsthand. And these experiences just underline his point that the American promise, it wasn't exactly universal, was it? He sees these harsh judgments, this tension of intermingled distinctness that feels really unstable, maybe unsustainable.
So, right. After seeing all of this, the massive scale, the economic engine chugging along, this individualistic character focused on getting the tough realities of labor and immigration, these flashes of intolerance. Wells keeps circling back to his main question: where's the nation's will? And his key insight here, which is kind of surprising, is the absence of a developed sense of the state, as he calls it, in many powerful people. He found this especially true among really successful businessmen who seemed totally focused on just their own companies, their own enterprises, often seemingly unaware or maybe just unconcerned with the broader community, the bigger picture.
Like that guy J. Morgan Richards, the advertising agent. Wells describes him as completely wrapped up in his business, almost unaware the community existed beyond that, or the manager of the Oneida community. Wells sought his constructive instincts, his devotion, but it was all poured into the corporation, not into some larger vision for America. And Wells saw this narrow focus as a potentially huge problem, a real impediment to the nation being able to, consciously direct its own future together.
But amidst all that concern, he does find these glimmers of hope, signs of maybe an intellectual life waking up, pushing back against just pure business and materialism. He points to the rise of these popular 10-cent magazines that were actually tackling serious public issues, getting people thinking. He sees important stuff happening at universities, Harvard, Chicago, even Columbia, which seems kind of remote then. And he really praises figures like President Eliot at Harvard, calls him someone with an open, balanced, and constructive mind.
And then, of course, there's President Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt. Wells sees him as almost the embodiment of the seeking mind of America displayed. Roosevelt's curiosity, his wide reading, the fact that he seemed willing to think out loud, even change his mind. Wells found that really unique, and maybe representative of a potential shift. He wasn't part of the old, fixed political machine. He'd stuck through, as Wells put it, by a conspiracy of political accidents, which suggested to Wells maybe a different path for leadership, one driven more by ideas and asking questions.
So Wells leaves America with this really complex feeling, doesn't he? It's almost contradictory. On one hand, immense hope. He sees the potential. He actually calls the American people the finest people upon earth, the most hopeful. High praise, but then deep, profound doubt. He worries they could be held back by what he saw as their vanity and hastiness, and crucially, by that lack of concentrated will, that inability, maybe unwillingness, to really pull together for a shared purpose beyond just individual success. He actually ends his book wondering if, despite everything, a decline and fall might still be written about this incredibly energetic nation.
Wow. What a journey seeing early 20th century America through his eyes. We've seen that sheer, sometimes just overwhelming scale of material progress, those floating cities like the Carmania, New York skyscrapers, that immense incompleteness, the lavish of light, the contrast with Boston's deliberate planned growth, the raw power struggle over Niagara Falls, and that dark disorder of Chicago.
Yeah, and then contrasting all that bigness with the human side he observed, his really stark insight about the economy concentrating wealth, while lots of people felt like they were missing out, even if things seemed generally prosperous. Truly shocking reality of child labor he uncovered, which he directly linked to prioritizing that liberty of property over, basic human welfare.
Yeah.
The whole complex picture of immigration to Ellis Island, the melting pot idea versus the tough reality of exploitation and maybe failed assimilation, and those unsettling examples of intolerance, the harsh judgments against people like McQueen or Maxim Gorky.
And he really wrestled with the American character, didn't he? Coming to see it as essentially middle class, intensely individualistic, all rooted in that fiercely defended liberty of property, and seeing that focus on getting as the real root of graft, not just in politics, but as this fundamental defect of moral method running through everyday business. Perfectly shown by Alderman Hinky Dink Kenna.
And that search for America's will, bringing him to that key but kind of nuanced conclusion. Finding that widespread lack of a developed sense of the state, especially among powerful business figures like J. Morgan Richards or the Oneida manager, totally focused on their own thing. But his hope, where he found it, was in those signs of an intellectual awakening. Those 10-cent magazines talking about real issues, the potential in the universities Harvard, Chicago, Columbia, and especially in people like President Eliot, and particularly President Roosevelt, who he saw as embodying that seeking mind of America displayed.
So ultimately, he left with this mix. Immense hope, grounded in the people themselves and those intellectual stirrings he saw, but also a profound doubt, rooted in what he called their vanity and hastiness and that potentially crippling lack of concentrated will. He saw a nation that could do anything, really, but also one facing the very real possibility of its own decline and fall.
It really does bring you back to that central question he kept grappling with, doesn't it? Where is the nation's collective will actually pointed?
So, thinking about Wells's search and everything he observed back then, where he saw that creative spirit as the crucial thing pushing back against decline, showing up in thoughtful people and intellectual work, here's something for you to think about. Given those specific realities and potentials he saw over 100 years ago, where might you look today in the world you live in to find expressions of that same kind of creative spirit? Or perhaps signs of its absence?